So there's a handout for today's class if you want to take a look at it. And there's also a sheet called Week 5 Review and Demo. And then we'll get going in about 5 minutes, a little bit less than 5 minutes actually. So I'm just going to share my screen and finish setting things up. Whilst I'm waiting for the other people to get here, we've got a couple of minutes before the class starts. If you've already got your thumbnail sketches done for this project, you can upload those. And then during today's class, what I would like to do with some of the thumbnails is just take a look at them and then make suggestions for how you could go about drawing those kinds of forms. Giving you some suggestions for like solving the problem of the sketch if you're not quite sure how to go about making it. So we had looked at one way, which was to image trace your sketch after you've inked it in Photoshop, or you could ink it on paper actually and then scan it in and image trace it. But another way you could build it is to build it from scratch in Illustrator by creating shapes over the top of your sketch, or just simply drawing shapes in the program and having the sketch to one side sort of thing. Hi, Michelle. Hi, Maria. Hi, Jillian.
Good morning.
Hi, Miguel.
Morning, Professor.
How are you guys doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. So there's a handout for today's class in modules, and then there's also an Illustrator file that you can download, which is in PDF format. That one is it's called Review and Demo, Week 5 Review and Demo. All right, let me take a quick screen capture to see who's here. And then make sure that that shows everybody's name. It's Miguel that has the LA one, huh?
Yeah, I have that logo from the Gmail. I don't know why I picked it up.
It doesn't show your name, Miguel Jimenez. So. It's Miguel Jimenez, right?
Yeah. Try to change.
For some reason, your name doesn't show up. It just shows the LA logo. So. I got you. Actually, let me do one more because Amanda just came in. All right. So I set up this sheet because the project that we're working on right now is the character design project. And I wanted to go over some of the stuff that we've covered up until this point, and then also kind of introduce a couple of other things. And so I wanted to clarify certain points because I think it's easy to sort of get confused when I'm doing the demonstrations to think that this is the way you should do it. The only reason I put the tracing is just to check to make sure everybody turned in this assignment. So if you haven't done this one already, make sure that you do the tracing exercise and turn it in. It'll be considered late at this point if you haven't turned it in, but you should have done this one by now. And then remember that the big project that we're working on right now is the character design project. So this page that I have here on the sheet is to give you a suggestion for the way to approach it by starting off with a silhouette. And the reason for this is that with character design, one of the main things that you want to try and establish is to have a very strong silhouette that the character carries. So that even if you see the silhouette if you see the character just as a silhouette, you'd recognize it. And so by starting this way, by starting with just the shape, it kind of simplifies the process down so that to begin with, all we have to think about is the overall shape, the overall silhouette of the character. We don't have to think about any of the detail. Almost always in drawing, the process is to go from simple and then gradually refine to more detail in various different ways. So in drawing in a life drawing class, for instance, you might start off by simply placing marks as to where things are and then drawing in sort of boxy shapes very lightly for where the body is and so on. And then you start to refine it. So in this process, we're starting off with one simple shape, and then by adding points, and remember, you can do this by simply using the pen tool. If you select this shape and then choose the pen tool, and to begin with, this could all be just straight lines. So we could start off by, if I wanted to add more detail on the hand, for instance, here, I can click here to add a point, and then click there to add another point. And then I can pull this point down. So we create a little step there where the hand and the sleeve connect. And I could add another point here and bring it up a little bit more. So now we have the curve starting to take place for the hand here. So you see the way that the hand sort of forms here. And then in the final version, I've started adding detail for the fingers and the thumb and the other hand. I haven't finished the shading on this, but I've started adding some detail into it. So you begin by just adding points and moving those points around to find the shape that you're looking for, This initial shape I drew is a random shape. So I drew it, I don't know whether it was in your class or in the last class, just to kind of give you an idea. You just start off by drawing a sort of random shape out. And then what does that shape suggest to you? So I'm not saying that you necessarily start your character design like that. You could start with a sketch and then draw out a silhouette of that. You don't have to start with a random shape. But then it's a matter of modifying. Once you've got the basic structure down, you could start curving out the shapes. And you could do these sort of simultaneously. You could add points and curve out shapes at the same point. Remember that the anchor point tool allows you to curve shapes. So if I pull here, it allows me to curve that path. So if you're on the pen tool, you don't really necessarily need to switch tools because by holding Option, you will get the anchor point tool. So you could add a point here, for instance, so that you could pull the sleeve in a little bit and create like a curve in that position. Here, maybe I want to have more of a curve, so I can hold Option, gives me the anchor point tool, and create a little bit of a curve there. Maybe I don't want that point. So remember, when you're on the pen tool, if you put your cursor over a point, you can take a point out. And by taking a point out, obviously that changes the shape of the object, unless that point isn't really doing anything. So this is the basic approach to that. You start with a simple silhouette and you gradually refine it until the overall shape is basically how you want your character to be, right? From there, you can then go in and start adding detail. So if you look at all of the detail in this, it's all just shapes drawn on top of that silhouette. So these highlight shapes, it's just a gray shape sitting on top of that. This is another shape sitting on top of that. The face is a shape sitting on top of this. So the overall shape of the face is actually kind of hard to grab. It's that one right there. So that I drew on top. And then on top of that shape, I've drawn some additional shapes to add detail into the eyes and to add highlights and shadows and so on. And then within here, I've added this hand and this book, which are not part of the silhouette, of course. You can't really see that, but I would assume that a hand would come somewhere here. So it's just sort of fleshing out. I've also added some feet on the bottom of it. So this is one approach. You start with a silhouette and then you gradually refine it and build it out into something which is a more fleshed out character. This was two examples of when I've met individually with students to kind of help them with their characters. So this one actually is somebody in this class. This is Christopher's. And he had drawn the face, I think, right, Christopher?
Yes, that's correct.
So Chris had drawn this part of it, but he hadn't really done much else. And he was feeling a bit stuck with the character and what to do. So this actually, I image traced. So I just took a screen capture off his screen of the drawing, and then I kind of built it out a little bit. So what I was suggesting to him, Christopher, as you may know, probably has some physical disabilities. And so it's difficult for him to use the pen tool because the way that he controls the mouse is by blowing into a tube using semaphore, right?
Morse code.
Morse code, yeah. So by using Morse code, he can control the angle, going to left or right with the mouse. But it's difficult to create like a consistent path with the pen tool using that process. So what I'm suggesting here is it's just all built out of basic shapes. So for instance, the foot starts off as just an ellipse. And then you can modify that shape by using the direct selection tool. We can squash this shape up a little bit. We can maybe pull this point up a little bit. We can maybe pull this handle up slightly. So we can create a shape which is a little bit more organic, and you can control the way that the shape feels like it's directed. So this feels more like the foot is coming towards you. This one looks more like it's going to the side. And then I had redone this the other day in class, and so this one's not quite the right size, but these are supposed to be the right size. They're supposed to be the same size, I should say. But the way that this starts is if you just simply start with a rectangle for the leg, because of the shape of the rectangle, it will appear as though it'll appear like the leg is very, very flat because the bottom of the rectangle is a squared off shape. So it feels almost like the thickness of a piece of paper maybe. But to give it some more thickness, if we use the convert anchor point tool again, or the anchor point tool, sorry, it used to be called the convert anchor point tool. So if I say that, it's a misspeaking. But if I drag this down, as I drag it down, I'm holding shift. If I don't hold shift, it would do that. And the curve is not really an accurate representation of a rounded shape at the bottom of a shape in perspective. Whereas if I hold shift, it pulls those handles so they're controlled to come down straight. That creates an exact ellipse at the bottom of here. So it feels like a cylinder. So if I wanted her leg to feel like a rounded cylinder, which is sort of what a leg is, not exactly what a leg is. Obviously it's a vast stylization of what a real leg is like, but it is sort of like a cylinder basically. So this is all made out of basic shapes. The hand, we don't need this thumb actually anymore. This hand is made out of an ellipse. And then if you manipulate the ellipse a little bit, so we maybe bring this point down, maybe add another point into there. So remember to add a point, I can use the pen tool. And then we can pull this inside there, and we can pull this around there. So by manipulating the points on the shape, again, just kind of like with the silhouette demonstration, actually, very similar, we can then create a more complex shape out of that very simple elliptical form by adding, subtracting, moving points around. We'll end up with something more like one. Obviously, you could also, if you wanted to, you could draw this with the pen tool, and maybe it's easier, but like I was saying, for Chris, it's difficult for him to use the pen tool because of the process he's using. And also, sometimes it's easier just to start with a simple shape and then modify it. Doesn't really matter how you ultimately end up with the result. I'm just giving you suggestions, some ideas as to how to approach it. So with this, for instance, I'm starting off with a circle below there for the walking stick and sending that to the back. Let's change the color of it so you can see it more easily. And then if I put a rectangle below that, and we join these two together by using Shape Builder, and then send it back again. And then at the bottom, I'm going to do the same thing I did with the leg. So to make it feel like it's rounded, I'm going to use the anchor point tool and drag down holding shift to create a little bit of a curve on the bottom of it. And then I'm going to select those 2 points and scale it. So let's scale it, say 75%. And then I'm also going to move it in a little bit. So the purpose of doing that is that generally when you stand and you lean your hand on a walking stick or a cane, it tends to not be perfectly straight, you know. So one of the ways to help to give a sense of realism, cartoon characters are abstractions, obviously. Some of them more than others. Some of them are more exaggerated in their abstraction than other cartoon characters. But nevertheless, they're a stylization. They're a representation of something which is real. And what you're trying to make is something which is convincing. So although the anatomy may not be accurate, it should have some relationship to reality. So this one is another, this was taken again from a sketch from a student, and they weren't quite sure how to go about drawing this shape. This was just a pencil sketch. And so what I had done with this, again, was similar to what I was doing with Chris's, is starting off with simple shapes and then building them out from that. The leg is basically a reflection, although I've done the shadows afterwards, and I have modified the shape of the leg so they're not identical. The boot is basically a reflection as well. And so on this, if you look at it, the boot actually goes all the way through the back there, and the shape of the front of the boot here is defined by the leg. And then the details like the laces are added over the top of it. So this part of the laces is just one shape. And then the laces on the side where they're coming out are these additional shapes on the side, and there's a highlight on the boot. So I might go in and add more detail onto that, but it's enough to give a sort of fairly solid representation that this is on the top of the boot. We've got these untied laces trailing off of them. For this part right here, for the eye, I'm making it so that it feels like it's a hole in the head. So to do this, if I start with an ellipse, like this, drag this across like that, hold Option, select them both, and then with the Shape Builder tool, I can Option click to get rid of this part. And then this inside shape, I'm going to change it so that the whole of that is filled in with black. So I'll select this part, fill that in with black. Now that'll sort of feel like a hole. You could also add to that by making this gray color into a gradient. So if we were to add a gradient to this and have the gradient go so that it starts dark at the top and then gets lighter as it goes down, the gradient would probably want to be edited a little bit. So if I double click on the gradient tool, right here, I wouldn't want the highlight to be white. So I'll bring this up and just make it into a gray color. And then I'm also going to have it go a little bit darker again this end. So this way it starts to feel as though it's going around that corner, you know? It's sort of bending it. The gradient helps to make it feel like it has a three-dimensional form to it. And then again, I'm doing the shading. Just to remind you how I'm doing the shading on these characters. To a large extent, what I'm doing is I'm drawing a shape around the outside, and then I'm using shape filters to get rid of anything that I don't want. So if I use the pen tool on here, let's choose this color so that we're using that color. And then if I draw a shape around here that goes something like this. So I'm following the muscle. Here it would probably come over and then around here. And then we can go outside of this shape like this and down the other side. I'll have some shadow that comes around here and then up along this side of the leg. And then this is set to multiply. So it's actually the same color as the leg, but it's set to multiply. So if you're doing shadows, multiply is oftentimes what you would use to express that, because a shadow is basically a darker version of the same color. So if I select that and the leg shape, and then I use shape builder and I option click on this side and this side, we've then got rid of that stuff that we don't need. Now there's a bit here that overlaps the skirt, but I can just change the blending mode. Let's change the stacking order. So if I select all of this now and send it to back, then that'll be behind the dress. This bit actually, this back part of the dress wants to go behind the leg, so I'll send that behind that as well. So that's generally how I'm doing the shadows. You don't necessarily need to use shape builder. Like on this one here, actually, it's the wrong color. So let's do this one again. On this one, another way you could do it is as long as you've got this black line around the outside, and obviously your character may not have a black line around the outside, but if it does, then when you're creating this, let me change the color of this to the same color that it's going to sit on top of. For this one, actually, I'm going to make it slightly darker just because I know that this kind of color doesn't tend to multiply very well. So I'm going to set it as a little bit darker and then change the blending mode to multiply. And then I'm going to draw a shape that goes through here. So it's going to go along this edge, down here, up into here, around here. And then I can just stay within this black shape. I don't have to do this accurately, but this will save me having to use the shape builder tool to get rid of stuff. I can just go anywhere in here as long as it's within that black shape of the stroke. You won't be able to see it because it's set to multiply. So it doesn't show up against the black because multiply is darkening. So as black is as dark as it's going to go, it just sort of disappears into that. It can't make it any darker. This part, you'll notice there isn't a corner widget. This is because it's too acute of an angle. So I could just add a couple of points there, remove that one, and then I can round it off that way. That's the old school way of rounding a corner. And, you know, maybe there's a little bit more detail in there. So that's a way to approach the shadows. Shadows are generally darker versions of the same color that it's sitting on. So using multiply is a good way to apply the shadows. You don't necessarily need to use multiply. You could just darken the color. But by using multiply, it makes it really easy along these edges because I can hide the edge in that black. So I don't have to draw the shape as accurately. Does that make sense? Okay, so that was the next page. This page talks about creating dimension. So you don't necessarily have to do characters that have a sense of dimension to them. They could be quite flat. That could be the style of your characters. But I think it is an interesting proposition to try to create characters that express form. Most characters do to some extent or another. So it's a useful thing to try to understand. A very simple expression of three-dimensional form is simply taking a rectangle and then dividing it. So this rectangle I've divided, and you could divide it in a couple of ways. So one way to divide a shape would be to use the knife tool. And if I select a shape and then hold Shift Option and drag through it, Shift Option keeps it straight. So normally when you want to constrain something to a straight line, you would hold Shift, right? Like if you're drawing a line with the line segment tool, for instance, Shift will keep it straight. Or if you're drawing a rectangle and you want to constrain it so that it ends up as a square, you can hold Shift. Or if you're drawing an ellipse and you want to constrain it as a circle, you hold Shift. But for some reason with the knife tool, you have to not only hold Shift, but you also have to hold Option to constrain it. That's the only instance I know of that. For some reason, we have to hold both Shift and Option to keep it straight. Okay, so now I've done that and I've divided this shape into two. With the direct selection tool, I can select these two anchor points that meet together at the same point right here, and I can nudge them up. And I can select these 2 points and nudge them down. And we now have something which vaguely resembles a box or a cube, right? So there's the dividing line. If you make one side of it a little bit darker, it exaggerates that sense of form further because there are two things that define form, three-dimensional space. One of them is perspective, which is what we're doing by creating these angles. These lines are now running off in parallel towards a vanishing point, and they're gradually tapering towards a vanishing point on the horizon. So this line, if I was to draw a guide across and then do Command 5 to make it into a guide, and then I draw another one here, Command 5, that is your vanishing point right there. And that's your eye level. The eye level is the same as the horizon, okay? So with this box, I've also added a third point of perspective. So when we're looking down on something, the bottom of the box would be narrower than the top of the box. So I've tapered this in a little bit. You can see this better on something like this, actually. I'll exaggerate it. So this is 3-point perspective. Well, not only is it tapering down the sides this way, it's also tapering towards the bottom. So probably wouldn't be as exaggerated as that. It'd probably be more like this. I've just simply drawn this shape. So if you look at this example, I've only got two sides which are visible. But if I was to bring this down, this means that my eye level now must be above this point. So my eye level now, because if I was to draw the line up, it would go this way, right? And this one would go that way. So my eye level now is above the object, which means that I can look down and see the top of it. So if I can see the top of the object, I can simply draw that shape by using the pen tool and going from this point to this point to this point. I have to guess this bit, but basically about there. And then the top surface would almost always be lighter. So I think we talked about that before. When you're applying light to a surface, think about the direction that the light comes from. And the light generally falls down because it's either coming from the sky, which is above you, or in a room, it is almost always coming from a light which is in the ceiling. So sometimes you might, like right now, actually, I have a light which is next to me. But I do also have a light which is coming in from the bedroom window over there, and they're generally fairly high up. They're not on the floor. So if you have a light below you, it looks quite weird. If you put a flashlight under your chin, for instance, let's see if I can do this. It looks quite kind of scary because we're not used to seeing it like that, you know. So if you put light like that underneath your face, it looks a bit terrifying because we're not used to seeing light coming from underneath somebody's face, you know. So when you're defining form, it's defined partly from perspective, the way things diminish as they go in space, and partly through what's called chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro is Italian for light and dark, shading. So by making something a little bit darker. Here's another example of it. So I start with a rectangle. Here I've modified the shape slightly different to make it a more rounded shape. What I've done is I've rounded the corners off, and then I've also distorted the shape. So if we took this one, this is basically what I'm doing. I'm taking this shape, and then with the direct selection tool, I'm pulling these corners in a little bit. So now it's in perspective, right? Then if we round the corners off like this, we've got a shape like that. And then to make it bend, I'm taking this shape and going to Object, Envelope, Distort, Make with Warp. And then we can bend that shape a little bit. So this is how this shape started. I've also bent it. You'll notice that it's a little wider at the bottom than it is at the top. So this is when you're doing the envelope distort. Let me undo that again. Object, envelope distort, make with warp. You can adjust these settings here to scale the top and the bottom of it. So this is the shape with a bit of color in it. And then here's the shading. So the shading this time is going to be a little bit different because I'm working with a rounded shape. So I have to think about the way that the shadow falls on that rounded shape. And also I'm simplifying it. It's not fading out. It's just a flat shape that I'm drawing. And so here I have to define where does that stop? How does that curve in, you know? But that gives me a reasonable representation three-dimensionally of what that form looks like. It's a stylization of it. It's a simplification of the shading. I've also added a little bit of highlight up here, which is a white gradient, which is fading from white to white. So if you look at the gradient, it goes from a white tab on this side to a white tab on this side. But on this side, the tab is set to 0% opacity. So the white is fading out to transparent at the bottom here. And then for the nose, all I'm doing is I'm starting with a rounded rectangle. And then if I delete this part, so I use the direct selection tool. So I select just that part of the shape, and then I could add another line up here. I've gone in and modified this shape further, obviously, and it might be easier in this case to start with the pen tool and draw it if you wanted to feel more organic. But I just wanted to point out that you could just start with a simple shape. If you have a hard time with the pen tool, you could start with the simple shape as a starting point and then modify it to the shape that you want it to be. And then I've added a little bit of shadow underneath here. This is kind of funny, I realize, because I've missed a massive amount of steps in between that and getting to this point. But but then you could add a little bit of detail onto it. You got that. But the shoes are kind of like the ones I've done for the other woman. It's basically an ellipse, which I've modified. For the bottom of the shoe, I've created a sole by duplicating it. So if you start off with an ellipse for the shoe, and then you modify that shape with the direct selection tool or with the pencil tool or whatever, you know, you modify the shape to what you want it to be like. And then this shape, if I wanted it to have a, I'm going to rotate it just slightly. If I wanted it to have a sole on the shoe, I could drag this shape up, hold Option to duplicate. You could just leave it like that and have that be the second part of the shoe, the bottom part, the sole. And then you can add the shadows in there. The leg, just like on the old lady, is rounded off at the bottom. So it feels like that's connecting into the shoe, but really it's just sitting on top, obviously. So this is just a shape which sits on top of that shape. This must be on a different layer. Yeah. So then it feels like it's connecting into it. And the shadows and the highlights, like this highlight right here, helps to make it feel like there's a surface there. Like there's a flat surface there for this shoe to kind of slot into. And then this shadow helps to sort of define that as being a more rounded form, you know? So it's not quite the right shape, but you get the idea. And then I've added some shadows in here. Okay, one of the things that I don't think we got to this in last week's class. I don't remember, to be honest with you. Did we cover creating patterns in the last class? I don't think I got to it, actually.
No, we didn't.
Okay, so one of the features in Illustrator that you can use, and you may be able to use this for the character design project, although not necessarily, but certainly in graphic design assignments, you can use this feature where you can create repeat patterns for creating textures. Also, as a graphic designer, you may be asked to do things like fabric design. Like I've worked for a clothing company before where I did fabric designs. I've also done fabric designs when I worked for a design studio in the 90s for Disney. We made a bunch of fabric designs for their Disney stores. Surface design is something which you could do actually as a career. So people just do nothing else but surface design, where they design fabrics or they design, you know, carpets, wallpapers, linoleum, all sorts of stuff which has patterns in it. And a pattern is basically a repeating set of elements, right? So we create something. When you make a pattern in Illustrator, you're creating a tile which ends up in the swatches panel. In earlier versions of Illustrator, you would create a tile and drag it into the swatches panel. And then if you wanted to edit it, you would drag it out, modify it, drag it back into the swatches panel. Now they have this feature, which is really useful because it allows you to see it change on the fly. So if I make a pattern like this is what a very famous old pattern, a gingham pattern. If you make a gingham pattern, it's basically one square which is dark, one square either side, well, sorry, one square to the side of that which is a bit lighter, and then one square below that which is even lighter, and then one square which is white. So if I select these, and then I go to Object, Pattern, Make, you'll get this message, which I always leave just for the purposes of classes, but you could get rid of this by putting Don't Show Again. New pattern has been added to the swatches panel. So it's telling you that this pattern that you're selecting is now in the swatches panel, and there it is right there. You can see it. And then it says any changes made while in pattern editing mode will be applied to the swatch upon exit. So any changes that I make whilst I'm working like this, right now I'm in pattern editing mode. And you can see that by this up here at the top, this gray strip where it says save a copy, done, cancel. And it also says new pattern 5. If I wanted to, I can change the name of the pattern. And then that will also change up here eventually. So there you go, gingham pattern. We also have this pattern options dialog box open, which allows us to make various changes to it. So if you look at the pattern, I'm going to zoom out a little bit. We have the actual swatch that I created, this tile right here, which is usually a square. Could be a rectangle of any proportion actually, but it couldn't be, say, a circle. It has to be a square or a rectangle. And then that blue line around the outside is this feature here. If you put your cursor over it, it says Pattern Tile Tool in the Pattern Options panel. It's that very first feature. And you can modify that. If you click on this, you can change the shape of this. So if I made it bigger, we would separate that out. So there's a gap in between each of those tiles. If I drag it in, we could crop some of that tile off so you don't see all of it. So for this particular case, I'm going to leave that as it is. Underneath that, you also have the tile type. So by default, this is grid, but you can also choose brick by row, which looks like that. Brick by column, which looks like that. Hex by column, or hex by row. So you can see in the hex state that the area here, this blue line, has changed to a hexagon. With the brick by row, what it's doing is it's offsetting the pattern. So a gingham pattern actually is unusual in that it isn't offset. Most patterns actually are usually use some form of an offset. So if you see a floral design or something like that, it's usually offset. And you can offset it by a half, or you can offset it by a quarter, or by a third, or by 2/3, or so on. Traditionally, before computers, to do an offset pattern is a very complex technical operation. It requires a lot of dexterity, a lot of skill, and a lot of understanding, conceptual understanding of the way that repetition works. But this tool kind of takes that away, and it makes it very easy for anybody to create a repeat pattern very quickly. So I'm going to put this back to its original format, grid, and then once you're happy with the final setup, you can just hit done. So that's how this pattern is being created. If I wanted to apply that to this shape, I can just click on that, and there's the pattern that I just made. This brick pattern is simply using a rectangle, which has got a stroke around the outside. The stroke is representing the mortar in the bricks. And you can see on this one, I've modified it a little bit more by adding some detail and shadows. But the way that this one started is I select this shape. I then go to Pattern, Make. And by default, of course, it's a grid structure, so it looks like this. To make it look more like a brick pattern, we can choose brick by row. We've got a pattern definition that's made especially for this. And so we're going to choose that and then go ahead and hit done. But if I wanted to add more detail, whilst I'm in this mode, whilst I'm in pattern editing mode, I could edit it further. So for instance, if I went to Object Expand, I could expand the stroke so that that's now a filled object. And by making that a filled object, I could select this shape on the inside, or at least all the anchor points on the inside of that shape. And I could round the corners very slightly. And I could also add a little bit of shadow so that it feels like the brick has some depth to it. So if I was to choose a darker color, and then draw a shape that maybe starts around about here, comes around that corner, goes down to here, goes across to here, click and drag to make a curve, go all the way over to this side, click and drag, go about halfway up this curve, click and drag, click back, go back the other way again, go to here, holding shift to keep it straight, go up to here, click and drag to create my curve, go all the way up to the top, and then back. So this is kind of subtle, but it creates like a little edge on that brick. So now it feels like it has some dimension to it. It's sticking out from the wall a little bit. And you could maybe go in with the paintbrush tool, or the blob tool would be better actually, and choose that same dark brown color. And we could use this to add detail. So I'm going to make my brush pretty small. Let's make this 0.5 of a point. Still seems too big. I don't think I can go any smaller than that actually. So I'm just going to have to make do with that. It's a bit bigger than I really want it to be. So we could make those marks in some other way, but you can see now that it gives it sort of like a cartoonish brick texture across there. So if I now hit done and I want to apply that, we simply select this, and then this is the brick pattern that I just created. On this one, what I'm doing is I'm drawing a series of shapes. One of them's got a gradient on it. This one has an effect. It's a zigzag effect that's applied to it. But if I select all that, I can use all that to create a pattern by choosing Pattern Make. Again, by default, it's a grid, and we could choose to offset it. So you can see, if you think of this as a grid, all of those blue triangles are in a line, both this way and this way. If I switch it to be brick by row, it offsets those. So it makes it less regimented, makes it feel more natural. So that's why offsets are quite oftentimes used in repeat patterns, is because it stops it looking quite so militaristically regimented. It makes it feel a little bit more organic and more natural. You can move objects around within here. So I can move this over here, and you can all easily see that take place, that change take place. You could also add stuff to it. So I could draw another shape on here. Deselect that. Let's change the color to yellow. And that will add to the pattern also. So it doesn't matter what you do to it in here, it'll keep adding to the pattern. Now, if you look at the bottom here, we have these overlap areas. And right now, nothing is being hidden. But if I was to choose hex by column, for instance, you may start to get stuff that gets cut off. Like you see here, this square is getting cut off at the top corner. Same here, it's getting cut off. So what we could do is move this one to a different position, or we could change the overlap position. So I could change the overlap here to that position. Now that's no longer getting cut off, but this circle is now getting cut off. So I could just move that one in there. Maybe move this one up there. So now we have a repeat pattern where nothing's getting cut off by adjusting these overlaps. So I think that's about it for the pattern swatches. Once you're done, you go ahead and hit done, or you could save it as a copy. If you didn't want to go over the existing one that you've already got and you're making edits to it, you could just hit done. And then lastly, on this last one, I just wanted to show you a representation of the fact that you could take any pattern that you've created and you can scale it without scaling the object. So let's say, for instance, you've applied this to a dress design that you've done. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to reflect it over itself like that. Hit copy, and we'll unite them. So I have a shape of a dress that I want to apply this pattern to. But I want the pattern to be a smaller pattern, because if you think about this as a full-size dress, that's a pretty big pattern. So maybe I want to edit that a little bit. This dress looks a bit sack-like, doesn't it? But you get the idea. Let's have this come in a little bit more. Okay, so if I want to change the size of the pattern without changing the size of the object, what I can do is double-click on the scale tool. And then over here, there's a thing for transform objects, and there's a thing for transform patterns. So if I take off transform objects, you should see that the object itself is staying the same size. And now I could scale the pattern to whatever size I wanted. So maybe I say it to 25%. Now we've got a small pattern that's running across that whole space. So that's patterns. The next thing I want to go over is using masks. There are two forms of masks in Illustrator: clipping masks, and then you also have what are called opacity masks. And they work differently, and they also are used for slightly different purposes. So I'm going to demonstrate this one by going to File, Place. So here I have two images. One is a blood splatter, and one of them is this peace sign, which I want. I've saved one as a JPEG. This other one is a PNG, but I wanted it to be a JPEG. So that's why I have two versions of this one. I'm going to select both of these. So as I'm placing them, I'm placing two images at the same time. Remember, I went to File, Place to place these images into Illustrator. I'm going to have link unchecked. I don't really need to show import options, so let's uncheck that as well. Then if I hit place, I have what's called a loaded cursor. So a loaded cursor shows you what you've got. I've got two images. You can see it says 1/2. And if I use the arrows on the keyboard, I can toggle between those images before I place them. So let's say I'd selected 12 images. I could toggle between all 12 of those images if I wanted to decide which one I want to place first. In this case, I want to place the blood splatter first. And then I want to place the peace sign over the top of that. With the peace sign, I want to convert this into a vector because I'm going to use the peace sign as a clipping mask for the blood. And a clipping mask has to use a vector shape. So remember that when you do image trace, I'm going to choose silhouette like we've done previously, and then go ahead and press OK. When you do that visually, this looks like a vector. If I zoom in close on it, it's totally sharp, which is what you'd expect from a vector graphic. You can see that behind it, the image is all pixelated, but the peace sign is totally crisp. So visually, this is a vector, but it is only visually. So this is an appearance of a vector. It isn't actually a vector until I click expand. Once I click expand, you can now see all of the anchor points. That's what makes it a vector. Okay, now I've got that as a vector. I can select over both the image and the peace sign vector, and I can choose Object, Clipping Mask, Make. The keyboard shortcut for that is Command-7 or Control-7. And you can see now that everything that was outside of the peace sign has disappeared. So we're using that peace sign as a mask to hide everything outside of it, so that we only see the image with inside that shape. So in this case, I'm using a bitmap image, but it could be vector shapes, which I'm masking as well, by the way. So I could take an illustration that I've done as a vector, like this one, for instance. This is all vector based. And I could then draw a shape over the top of it. And then I could select over all of that, do Command-7, and I could create a clipping mask for that. So a mask is where you're hiding something, right? It's a way for you to hide parts of the image. In this case, we're hiding everything outside that ellipse. In the case, Chris, you had a question for me?
Yes, I did. After you perform the, you make the clipping mask, is it still editable? Let's say you want to move the blood splatter more to the left or more to the right.
Yeah, so if you want to move the image separate from the mask, if I click here, you can see that there's a rectangle showing up. That means that I have the image selected. This is on the group selection tool. If you're on the selection tool, remember it always selects the entire group. So it's always going to select both the image and the mask because they are a clipping group. They're a group. So it's always going to select everything. So you need to be on the group selection tool. This way you can select either the mask by itself by double clicking on that. I had to double click on it because the mask is a compound shape made out of more than one shape. So when I first click on it, it just selects the one shape. If I click a second time, I then have that whole compound group. And if I was to click a third time, I now actually have the mask as well. But if I click twice, I've got just the mask. Now I can move the mask without the image moving. So if I move that across, you can see that now we're only seeing part of the blood splatter because the rest of it is just white around the outside of it. If I move it across here, you can see that the blood splatter is staying where it is and just the peace sign is moving. Whereas if I was to choose just the image and not the peace sign, I could move the image around inside the mask. Is that what you were asking me, Chris?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so that's a clipping mask. So a clipping mask can be used on images. It can also be used on multiple objects. Like this one's hundreds of different objects in there that makes up this illustration. But if I draw one shape over the top, the shape which is on the top, remember, is the one that makes the mask. In this case, we're actually making a mask out of multiple shapes because the peace sign is made out of that circle plus these shapes inside of it. The peace sign is actually what's referred to as a compound shape. So I'll give you another example. Let's say I take the polygon tool and I'm going to set this so that it has a black stroke with no fill. And I'm going to set the stroke size in the stroke panel. I'm going to set it to 0.5 of a point. So it's a very thin stroke. And then with the polygon, I'm going to drag out, let's set this to a hexagon. And as I drag out, if I hold down the tilde key, the tilde key is the one that looks like an Enya. It's just below your escape key or just above your tab key. It looks like an Enya in Spanish. It's like a wiggly line. That's the tilde key, spelled T-I-L-D-E. If you hold that down and then drag, you'll make multiple polygons. If you hold the space bar while doing that, you can move to a different place. So I can move here, then let go of spacebar and make some more bigger sizes. Move over here with the spacebar and make some bigger sizes. And the reason for me doing this is I want to have a bunch of shapes which I can mask. So I've got a bunch of shapes I can mask now. Now if I put a shape above this, so I'll use the star shape for this, and I'm going to make this a really obvious color so that you can see it in relation to all those black lines. So if I put this over the top and I select all of this, and do Command 7, we'll now have a mask for that with that star shape. You'll notice that the star lost its color completely. It's just a mask now. So the star itself has no fill and no stroke. You can actually add a stroke back into it if you wanted to. So if you wanted your mask to have a stroke around the outside, you can. But by default, it will get rid of that. You can also modify the mask in any way like you would any other shape. So for instance, I could round the corners. I could add points to it. I can modify it in any way that you could modify any other shape. Now, one thing that we don't have though is like, let's say I wanted to have a mask which is made out of more than one star. Let's say I have this star, but I also want to have a star down here that's masking and a star here. Now, whatever is the last shape that you draw is always the shape which is top in the stacking order. So in this case, the last shape I drew was that star, so that's the one that becomes the mask because it's the shape which is at the top which becomes the mask. But I want this shape and this shape and this shape to all be the mask. So if I do Command 8, it looks like nothing happened. But if you look in the layers now, those shapes all occupy the same level. They're all in this compound shape right here at the top of my stacking order. Let me bring my layers out, you can see this better. So all of these shapes here, all of these polygons, is that mess underneath. These stars are now one level. Before I did Command 8, they're all on separate levels. So the last one is the one that makes the mask. So if I select them all and I go to Object, Compound Path, and then Make, these are now a compound shape. So they all occupy exactly the same level as each other. In effect, Illustrator thinks of these three shapes as one now. If you put that one over the top of that one, it will become a whole because they will cancel each other out because they're on the same level. They can't actually go on top or below, so they cancel each other out and create a whole. So anywhere you see a hole in Illustrator, that's a compound shape. A letter O with a hole in the middle of it is a compound shape. It's an object that Illustrator sees as one shape, even though it's made out of multiple shapes. So then if we select over all of this and do Command 7, now we've got a clipping mask made out of those three stars. Does that make sense? So that isn't particularly useful because it's rare that you would need to make a mask out of more than one shape, to be honest with you. But it is useful to know just in case you have to, all right? The other type of mask in Illustrator is what's called an opacity mask. And this is produced in a very different way. If we open up the transparency panel and I select over this peace sign, let me get rid of the stroke off here. Okay, so if I select over the peace sign, you will see that show up here as a thumbnail view in the transparency panel. Next to it, you'll see a little bit of a gap. And then you'll see a space here, which if you leave your cursor on it, it says double click to create and edit mask. So you could either double click on this. You can also choose to make a mask by clicking on this button. Both of those do the same thing. The space between now has a link because the mask is linked to the artwork itself. This works in very much the same way as a layer mask in Photoshop. So if you're familiar with Photoshop, which most of you should be somewhat familiar with it, remember in Photoshop, when you do a layer mask, whatever is black becomes transparent. You can't see it on that layer. And anything which is white on that layer will become visible if you have it white on the mask. So here, because the mask is black, everything is invisible. Everything is transparent. If I unclip it so everything is white on the mask, we can see everything again. Now, if I click on the mask, I could apply black to this mask in a variety of different ways. I'm going to start off by creating a rectangle. And then on that rectangle, I'm going to apply a gradient. And I want that gradient to be, first of all, have that gradient be in the fill, not in the stroke. So I want the fill to come to the front. So if you look in the swatches here, right now the fill's in the front, now the stroke's in the front. You can see that here as well in the tool panel. The fill's in the front, now the stroke's in the front. So I want the fill in the front, and then I'm going to apply a black-white gradient. When we do that, you can see that the side of my peace sign is faded out. And it's not fading to white, actually. It's fading to transparency. So it looks like it's fading to white because what's behind is white. But if I was to go to View, Show Transparency Grid, you can see that that's actually fading to transparent space. So anywhere that is black on this mask, and you can see that in my Layers panel now, that all I see is the opacity mask. If I click here on the thumbnail view in the transparency panel, I got my layers back again. Remember that when you're working on the opacity mask, it's easy to forget that you're working on the mask, and then you try to select something over here and you can't select it. And you're like, why can't I select that? That's weird. Wait, that doesn't make any sense. I can't select anything. It's because we're on the mask now. The only thing you can select when you're on the mask is stuff which is on the mask, which is this gradient. If you want to see the mask, by the way, you can option click on it, and that's what the mask actually looks like. And remember, you can control this mask in any way you like. You can change the gradient. You could apply black in other ways. So I could draw a black rectangle over the top of this, for instance. And then that would become completely transparent in that area right there. You could also even paste a photographic image into it. So if you took a black and white photograph, it could even be a color photograph actually for that matter, but it's only using the tonal values. But if you click on the mask, you'd actually have to option click on it so you can see the mask, and then you could paste a photographic image into that, and then that would work as the mask. So you could, for instance, do a scribble in Photoshop with a pen tool, paste it into here, and then that scribble would show up here. So those are the two types of masks. I'm going to click to get out of here, and I'm going to hide my transparency grid. Do you all follow that so far? Just to clarify the distinction between the clipping mask and the opacity mask. The clipping mask has to work with a vector shape, so it's hard edge. So for this kind of thing where you've got a hard edge shape that you want to mask, an opacity mask works well. A clipping mask works well. An opacity mask enables you to have areas which are transparent and areas which are visible based off of levels of opacity. So this is actually good if you want to have transparency, which is soft transitions of tone, like a gradient or a blend or a photographic image where you have subtle transitions of tone, then the opacity mask works well for that type of thing. Okay, another, Chris, you had a question?
So you said it has to be a compound shape first, right?
Only if you want to make a mask out of more than one shape.
Okay.
If you're making a mask out of one shape, then it doesn't need to be a compound shape. And most of the time, you're going to make a mask out of one shape. But if you want to make a mask out of multiple shapes, it has to be a compound shape. So this peace sign, when I image trace it, it actually is automatically a compound shape as soon as I made it. This thing, which I image trace, this character actually is a compound shape. So we could use him to make a mask for that artwork because he's already a compound shape, but only the line artwork. So where his shorts are, where that black line is, that's all one compound shape. So this example that I have on the screen, which I think I showed in last week's class, is an example of using image trace as a way. This is not the way to do it. It's not the way for you to do it. It is an approach. I think sometimes when I demonstrate this, that people think that this is the way that you have to do it, but you don't have to necessarily build your character like this. You could build it in Illustrator, like some of the examples I'd shown you earlier, like these ones where it's built in Illustrator itself. Or like these ones here. This one is done by using image trace. The thing that I like about this approach is that I can be very accurate about the drawing before I get to the point where I'm working in Illustrator, and I can retain a level of like hand-drawn quality to it. So it still has a feeling of being something which is drawn by hand more so than if I was to build it directly in Illustrator. So if you remember when I was doing this one, I think I'd done a demonstration last week of sketching in Photoshop. So this is another one that I was working on. If I have a pressure sensitive tablet attached to the computer whilst I'm working, I don't have one right now. Give me 1 second. So I would start off by, as you can see on this example, I would start off initially very, very rough with a sketch which is just sort of like that. It just kind of defines roughly where the position of stuff is. I'm not even attempting to try and add any detail or any real kind of, it's not trying to be precise. It's just trying to sort of feel out where the character might be. There's a great quote from, I think it's from Michelangelo, where he talks about seeing an angel in a piece of stone and then cutting away everything that wasn't necessary for the angel. This is kind of like what you're doing when you're drawing in a sense, or like that silhouette that I showed you earlier, where you start with a simple silhouette and you gradually build it out. It's like visualizing the character on the piece of paper and then putting it down. And then I'm making layers above that and gradually over time refining it. So this is a process, you know, like I'll do one layer, I'll refine it, make it a little bit more refined. And then I'll make, if it's not good enough at that point, I'll make another layer and then refine it a little bit further. But it's going in here and just sort of finding where the character is. At this point, I've got a pretty good sense of where the character is. So now I can start to add a little bit more detail in there. So I'm just going in and sort of painting marks into here. And you could always erase stuff as well. But for this process where you're going to image trace something, your final drawing wants to be fairly accurate. You want it to, like, you might end up doing a little bit of adjustment at the end in Illustrator, but to a large extent, you want to have it pretty nailed down in Photoshop. So right at the very top, I might have another layer. So this layer, I would lower the opacity on it so you can barely see it. And then over the top of that, using a different type of brush. So I'm sketching using these dry media brushes. Kyle Ultimate Pencil Hard is the one I generally use for sketching. Although you can experiment with some of these other pencils. And then for the inking, what I generally use is this Ultimate Inking Thin Thick. But again, you can experiment with some of these others. It depends on the kind of style that you're trying to get. And then on this layer is where I'm doing the inking. At the top here, I can choose to set pressure. So do I want to have always use pressure for opacity? And then also this one right here, which is if you leave your cursor on, says always use pressure for size. So that means that when you press harder, the thickness of the path will get thicker. And when you, where is it? Transparency. Oh, because it's got opacity. So I also set the opacity. So when I press lightly, it'll have lower opacity and a thin line. But if I press harder, I'll get a thicker line with thicker opacity. So I can choose to have those on or off. So if I just had the opacity off, but I have the size on, then the stroke will always be black, which is what I want for this because I'm inking it. I'm not sketching now, really. I'm really kind of creating a sort of more finished drawing for the character. And so for these lines, I want them to be a solid black. So I don't want the opacity down. I don't want the opacity to be pressure sensitive, but I do want the size to be pressure sensitive. So as I let go of the brush, so I press harder, I get a thicker mark. When I let go, it gets thinner. That gives me a more realistic kind of natural hand-drawn quality to it because it has those thicks and thins embedded within the design. And then once I've got to the point where I've inked the thing, and when I'm inking it, by the way, I might also be thinking about shading. So on this one, let me see if I did it on this one. Actually, not a whole lot, but a little bit. So I didn't do a lot in terms of the shadow here, but in terms of the inking here, I've actually included some shadow areas. So if you look along the back of the neck here, there's some shadow there, underneath the chin, underneath the armpit a little bit. The whole of the shorts is inked in solid because those are going to be black. There's also shadow here cast by him on the board. So it's not actually just line, it's line. If you look at good comic book illustrators, they're great at using black and white. They're really good at understanding how to define form just with black and white. So if you look at this example, for instance, the black and white, it's not really just a line drawing. There's solid areas of black in there which help to sort of define the shapes and the space and so on. And then with these, even though they're colored, you can see that there are areas of black in here which are defining the shadow. They solidify everything, keep everything sort of together in one place. So this is a good reference for that on, like, if you want to think about how to ink something, look at examples of really good comic book art and you get a really good sense of how to go about inking something, where to put the shadows. Think about where the light's coming from again. And so I'm not saying that you necessarily want to have cartoons, you know, your characters need to be as realistic as this. They can be much more cartoony, but it's still the same principles sort of apply. You know, you might be doing a style of character where it's much more simplistic. Like this one, for instance, has no shading really. It's all just flat shapes. And that's perfectly acceptable for this project. You don't necessarily have to get into doing really complex 3D stuff. It's not a requirement of the assignment. They just need to all feel like they belong together. But it is something which is interesting to explore, I think, in terms of creating characters. Okay, so this is one approach. Basically, the approach is that you do your illustration in, maybe you even do it on paper by hand, and then you ink it. So in the Photoshop one, I inked it in Photoshop. So inking is in quotation marks because I'm not really inking it as such, digitally inking it. But I bring that drawing in, I place it into Illustrator. So I do File, Place. I find the tracing. Let's see if I can find it now. Well, I'll use this one for the demonstration. So for this one, I've got this illustration. I can go ahead and choose this and place it. For some reason, it's not letting me place it. Very good. Weird. That's not really placed that way. Oh. Let me try a different file.
Professor, can you mute somebody? It's noisy.
I don't hear any noise actually, May.
You don't?
No.
Oh.
What do you hear?
Am I the only one here some noisy?
What is the noise that you're hearing?
Like a lot of people's crowded. What?
Really? I don't
Yeah.
hear that. Oh, that's funny.
I don't hear anything.
Oh goodness. Okay, never mind.
Yeah, Denise says she didn't hear anything. And Nathan says, I hear a noise, but it's not loud. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure.
Not loud. It's not loud. Just a
Let me see if I can
noisy.
find this. Sorry, I should have had this ready. I don't see why
Sorry.
I can find that file for some reason. Oh, here we go. Okay, so if I place this image, when I place it, I want to place it with link off and template off, and then hit place. Once I place it, I can then go up to the top here and choose image trace, and I would choose silhouettes. And then remember at this point, just like when we're doing the peace sign, this is not really a vector yet. So it has the appearance of a vector. And the reason for keeping it as an appearance rather than automatically making it a vector is that so that you can edit it. So if I go up here to this panel, I can, for instance, bring this slider down where the threshold is so that we have less black. You can see how the line got a little bit thinner there. So you can adjust this to go either further this way or further this way to define how much black is included. You can also make the paths more accurate, or you can make the corners more accurate. And the reason that you might want to make them less accurate, you might think, well, why wouldn't you make them as accurate as possible? Is that sometimes if you make them completely accurate, that's actually picking up all of the little pixels in the bitmap image. So by having it less accurate, it actually cleans it up a little bit. It smooths out the artwork, gives you a cleaner finish. Okay, once you've done all that and you're happy with it, then you expand it. But you have to expand it before we can go to the next step. So now it's literally a vector. Now that it's literally a vector, we can go in and do various edits to it. So for instance, there might be areas where we need to close a path. See if I can find one. I think there are some examples on this where the path is open. Like right here, the arm is open. If I want to close that up, I could use the blob tool, which is hidden with the brush tool, and I can just paint across there. You can see that in outline mode now, that's automatically fused together. Makes kind of a weird juncture here, so I'm just going to take out a couple of anchor points to clean that up. So by using the pen tool and putting it over the top of these anchor points, I can remove those additional anchor points and that'll clean up that edge. You can also clean it up by using the smooth tool. So the smooth tool, remember, will remove excessive points and kind of smooth off the line. You can also use the pencil tool. The pencil tool will allow you to redraw a path. So if a path is a little bit wobbly, you can sometimes use the pencil tool just as a way to sort of smooth it out. Like here, for instance, it's got a bit of a wobble along here. I could use the pencil tool and go across here and clean that up like that. So once you've cleaned it up and you're happy with the final thing, you can then select the overall artwork and then choose this tool, which is called the Live Paint Bucket tool. Now, this artwork by default, because we did silhouettes, in the color panel is set to grayscale. So open up your color panel, and before we make it into colors, let's change this to HSB. This will allow us to apply colors to it. Now, if I click here, I can fill it with color. And if you look at my cursor, you'll see that it has a color in the middle, which is red right now, and then yellow on the right and black on the side. If you look at my swatches panel, this is what's happening in the swatches panel right here. So if I use the right arrow, I can keep going through the swatches like that to choose a color. I can just toggle between the swatches and fill with that color. And then if I toggle to another color, I can fill with that color. I can also go into here though and choose a specific color like that. So you can very quickly go through here and throw in the color by just clicking on these areas. You notice the areas highlight in red. So this area where I want to color is right now it's highlighted in red. So if I click onto it, that's where it's going to fill. Here I can hold Option. This gives me the eyedropper tool. I can choose this orange color and I can finish filling in these areas. So this is one approach to coloring the line artwork, is to use the live paint bucket as a way to go in and color it. Remember, it's called the live paint bucket because it's still attached to the stroke. It's editable. So I could edit this path, like I could drag this out here. The color will go with it. It's not like there's a shape which is fitting exactly to that shape, and if I move that shape, then there's a disconnect. It's all active, it's editable. At a certain point, though, you might decide that you need to expand it so that it's no longer editable in that way, so that you could edit it in another way. So on this one that I've already done, I actually expanded it at a certain point. So the colors are actually separate shapes. So this part right here is a separate shape from the arm itself. And if I was to move this on the shape, we would have a disconnect between the black line and the color inside of it. So like I said, I have done character design a lot over the years. Partly the last 3 or 4 years, I did quite a bit for Microsoft. They have a thing every year called the hackathon. And over the last 4 years, I think I've designed 7 characters for them. Which we've done in various styles. The last style was as a comic book style like this. So this is the approach that I used for that, and it worked really well for that approach. Okay, the other thing that, did we go over the brushes in last week's class, do you remember? Did we talk about the brushes panel? I don't think we got to this actually.
I think so.
You think you did, Christine? Okay. So I'm just going to go over this briefly. So we looked at the various types of brushes. So if you look at the brushes panel, in the brushes panel, so mine has some additional ones because I've made some brushes, but you will have at the very top, you have a series of calligraphic brushes. This one right here is a brush that I've made, is a scatter brush. So this is what this star is right here. Then we have art brushes, including the one that I made here, which is this rainbow brush. And then I've also got this type of brush, which is a pattern brush, these ones down at the bottom here. This is also a pattern brush, the railroad. This one uses photographic images. So if I select this and click on here, you can see that if I zoom in on this, this is a photograph of denim seaming. So you can make a pattern brush out of photographic images as well. You can make any kind of brush actually out of photographic images. So you could place a photographic image into Illustrator, make it into an art brush and use it as a way to bend an image. So for instance, if you had a palm tree that was cut out from its background and placed in here as a PNG, you could use it as a way to bend that palm tree by making it into a brush and then bending it. So to make a brush, you draw whatever shape you want to create into a brush. So for this one, I had done a rainbow, but it could just be a simple shape. Like let's say, for instance, I draw an ellipse and I make this black. And then at the ends, I'm going to use the convert anchor point tool to get rid of the corners. So we've got a shape that looks like this. I can make this into a brush. I think I must have hidden my bounding box. There we go. So if I squash it a little bit and then drag this into the brushes panel, I can choose art brush and then press OK. You can see that in this dialog box that opens up when we drag the brush in there, you can see the 5 different types of brushes that exist in Illustrator. So we've got calligraphic brushes are grayed out. This is because this isn't created by dragging something into the brushes panel. It's simply created by adjusting the settings in the brushes that already exist. A scatter brush, however, is available. So is an art brush and so is a pattern brush, because these are created when you drag something in there. So when I drag this shape into here, I could make it a scatter brush, I could make it an art brush, or I could make it a pattern brush. The bristle brush, again, is a brush which is only created by changing settings. So here's an example of bristle brush. I could double click on it to change its settings. But for this, I'm going to make it an art brush. And then I'm just going to go ahead and press OK. Now, if I wanted to paint with that, I can choose the paintbrush tool, select that brush, and then I can paint with it. And you can see how that works. So with this brush, I've created this by creating a series of rectangles over the top of each other. Did I demonstrate this in the last class?
Yes.
The rainbow brush?
Yes, you did.
I did. Okay, I won't demonstrate that again then. And I think there's a video for that anyway. So I'm not gonna waste time going over that again. But you could put whatever graphic you want into the brushes panel. So here I've dragged this one. This one is simply this shape. So it's actually Illustrator is creating this corner tile. Let's ignore that for right now. This is the shape that I made here that I used for creating that train track brush. So it's just something which is going to repeat over and over again. This is a border brush. So the way that a border brush works, unlike an art brush, which stretches a graphic along the path, the border brush just tiles it, one next to another, next to another, next to another. And it also creates these corners. So for instance, on this one, if I choose this brush, you can see that it's made a corner like this. If I double click on the brush, we can actually choose from different corners. So this is the tile that I made and dragged in there, and then it's generating these additional corners that if I wanted, I could switch. It also actually generates corners here, although it doesn't add them in. So if I wanted to make an inside corner, I have that option also. For these end positions, you'd really have to make your own. So you'd have to create something which you could end that line with. Okay, so that's the brushes panel.
I have one question.
Sure.
What does that 6 mean next to the line in the brushes panel, like with the little speaker icon?
On this one right here?
Yes.
So this icon right here actually is a brush. It's a feather brush, a mop brush, I should say. And the 6 is the size of it. So if I double click on it, we can change the size of that here. And if you press OK, you should see that that will then change in this setting. So it's just telling you the size of the brush, basically.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so the last page I have on here is going over gradients. I think we looked at this in last week's class too, right? And again, some of this is on the next handout. Remember that you have in modules, don't forget that there is this exercise sheet number 4, which is also in the assignments section. And this is due next Friday. So you have 2 weeks to work on this exercise sheet. But this one includes some of the things I've gone over in today's class. And there are videos. So all of these videos here, which are on last week's class, are for creating this video. Sorry, for creating this worksheet. So let me just download this one real quick and show you. So if you haven't done this one already, which I think most people haven't, don't forget that you have to have this one done for next week. Just like the other worksheets we've done, this has a template at the bottom. So if you look in the layers, it's got one layer which is a template, which should be locked, by the way. And then inside there, there's a work layer. you're just going to recreate these. So that's the scatter brush. Then creating gradients. This bottom part is a blend. This is a spiral. So did I demonstrate how to take a spiral and attach it? Attach the dots to the spiral, or attach a blend to the spiral? Let me show you
Yes.
that one. I did demonstrate it?
Yes.
Okay, so there's videos anyway for all of these. This is due for next week's class, okay? And then the last sheet on here is just going over gradients. So the idea of this was that gradients can be used as a way to define form. This goes back to that idea of chiaroscuro, shading, light and dark illustrations. So by positioning the shading within an illustration, you can define the three-dimensional form of objects. So in this case, for the sphere, we're defining the form by positioning the highlights. If you look at the gradient, this gradient, where's my gradient? I don't know. It's right here. So if I look at the gradient for this, I've got a highlight at this end. So this is this right here. Then we've got a shadow area, which is right here. And then we've got some reflected light at the bottom of the sphere to make it look more spherical. For the shadow for this one, I've got one ellipse, which is a dark gray, that fades to a larger ellipse, which is white. So this is a blend, which is going from this shape to this shape. So if I was to take the blend away, object, blend, I can choose release. You can see that this is what I've got. I've got a white ellipse and then this dark gray ellipse. By clicking on one shape and then clicking on the other, we create a subtle transition of tone between those two shapes. So one thing to bear in mind about the blend tool is that it blends from one color to another, but also from one shape to another. So this is not only getting bigger, but it's also actually subtly changing shape across the surface. Unlike a gradient where it's graduating across a distance or radiating out from a center point. This, we can change the blend by repositioning this shape. You can see how now it's much sharper here. If I go into the middle here, it's a subtle transition all the way across. So it gives us a different type of control with the blend tool in terms of creating those subtle, soft transitions of tone. And then this one is just an example of using gradients to create reflective surfaces. So on here, there's a lot of gradients, there's a lot going on obviously on this one, but there's over the top, I have this shape, which is just kind of like a reflective shape. There's another shape here, which is a color overlay. So this is a gradient which uses this new feature in Illustrator, which started, I think it was in the last version of Illustrator, where they have this freeform gradient. So the freeform gradient allows you to add points randomly across the surface to define the gradient. So rather than going in one direction or graduating out from a center point, you can have it graduate from different points across the surface. A little bit like the mesh tool over here that you may have come across previously. So that overlay is just adding the color to it. Everything else was just in grays. And then over the top of that, I've image traced some palm trees and applied a gradient to those so that it feels like something almost photographic is reflecting in the surface. I think that's it. So let me just go back to the handout for today's class and make sure I've covered everything that I wanted to cover.
I have a quick question.
Sure, Amanda.
Yeah, when I'm working on the template, I don't see the grids for some reason. Like I see it if I turn off the template, but if I have the template on, I can't see the grid line.
So you're talking about this underlying grid here?
Yes.
So you,
like to make the shapes
can't
accurate.
see that when the template's on. Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah. So which one did you need the grid for?
Well, just in the past when I'm working on the exercise sheets, I don't see it.
Oh, okay.
And so like I kind of struggle to get it.
On the template there, the grid is behind the template actually. So
Okay.
the reason you don't see it is that the template on this layer is covering everything. So if you turn the template off, you're right, you would see the grid. But if you turn the template on, because that image covers that whole page, you'd only see the grid outside the page. You can, I think, if you go to Illustrator Preferences, Guides and Grid, you can go to have grids in back turned off, and then you'll see the grid over the top of the template.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
All right, does anybody else have questions?
Yeah, let's say you wanted to recolor your character, the skateboard guy.
Yeah.
If you select all your shapes, how would you, like, you know, when you exaggerate like the hue or the...
Yeah, okay. So if I, let me go back to that area. So if I select this whole illustration, the way I had suggested coloring in the past with something like that, if you wanted to adjust the coloring of this, is to use the recolor artwork feature. I'm gonna have to move you guys out of the way a second. So if I select all of this, and then I go to this area at the top in the control bar where it says recolor artwork, and then click on here, then click on edit, then link all the colors together. I can then adjust the hue slider to adjust to, like, change all the colors at once. So if I wanted to adjust all of the colors, like maybe I want to make everything less saturated, for instance, I could go to, let me see where the original color was. Here. If I wanted to make everything more saturated, I could do that, or less saturated, I could do that. And if I wanted to make everything brighter, I could lighten everything like that, or darken everything like that. I can also choose a specific color. So if I unlink them, I could take one specific color, like maybe this yellow, and shift it. Is that kind of what you were asking me?
Yeah, that's it. That's cool.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right, cool. All right, so I think I've covered all the things I wanted to cover in today's class. I've gone over clipping masks and opacity masks. What I would like to do now is, if you have them already uploaded to Canvas, I'd like to take a look at some of the thumbnail sketches and maybe make suggestions for how we redraw them. I don't want to spend too long on this because it's already 10:24. In fact, I can't spend too long on this because I have a meeting at 11 o'clock today on Zoom again. So I spend my life on Zoom these days. Crazy. I've got another one at 11 o'clock today. I'm being the student this time. I see how bad it is for you guys. But I'm going to go to assignments and character design. And then, does anybody have one that they want to show me that they're not sure how? What I really want to look at is thumbnail sketches that you've done, but you're like, I have no idea how I would actually draw that. So there's anybody that wants me to look at their particular drawings? These are Michelle's.
Yes.
Are any of those that you're not sure how you'd approach drawing them?
Well, I think I did all the first page with all the characters. The last one I kind of just did yesterday after I did all the little sketches.
Uh-huh.
And then I realized maybe I should just simplify everything, like the kind of like a Hello Kitty with no mouth, or not focus on the face.
Yeah.
So more like the size and stuff. I think that's kind of the level I can handle right now.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I can draw by hand, but when I do it in Illustrator, I have to consider the time frame I have and then the skill I have.
Absolutely, yeah. It's always a consideration.
Mm-hmm.
In professional situation as well, you know, like if you get a job and their budget is, you know, $400 and you charge $100 an hour, you can spend 4 hours on it, right? It's how long you get. All right, so I did a screen capture of that. If I bring the rabbit into Illustrator, one thing I want to show you, because I think that this is common with the rabbit, that people try to do this and not quite accomplish it, is bending the ear. So I'm going to do file place. And then let's find that screen capture. So like on this ear, you have like an overlap that takes place. So if we draw out the overall shape, and I didn't place this as a template. So let me put this image on a template layer. I'm going to go to Window, Layers. My layers are open somewhere. So I'm going to make a new layer. I'm going to put the image onto this new layer, drag that one to the bottom, double click on it, and choose template. That locks that layer automatically. Let me change this to black and white so you can see it. And then I can view it in outline. So your ear looks like it comes down maybe around about here. And then this would probably go behind the head. So we'll just round this off a little bit. Okay, so for this, what we could do is at this point right here where you want to show the inside of the ear, we could have another shape like this. And if we go outside the shape like that, we could select both of these and then use Shape Builder, which is right now hidden with my live paint bucket, and then Option click to get rid of that part of it. And then you would have that sense of it overlapping. It might be that you use multiple shapes. So you could have one shape which does this kind of thing. And then you could have another shape which goes over the top of that, which does this. And so this might be useful if you have a stroke around the outside of it, because you can end up with this kind of overlap created, which helps us to understand that this is overlapping it. So whether it starts off as one shape, like I think on the one that I showed you earlier, let me see. On this one, for instance, this is one shape right here. And then this pink shape is drawn inside of it. But it creates the illusion of something going over the top. And that's because of that sharp angle right there. Makes it feel like this cuts over the top of it. And then I've gone in and added some little hairy bits on the outside of it. All right, I'm going to go back to... Was there anything else on there that you saw that you weren't quite sure how to go about producing?
No, I think once I came up with the solution being more flat drawing, I think I'm
You're
feeling
okay.
better. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I think with yours, for the most part, I would just focus on drawing shapes on top of each other. So for instance, like the dress is one shape and the legs would go behind that. You can have them be a little bit longer. Don't try to match the edge, just have them go a little bit longer than they go behind.
Right.
And then the jacket can go over the top. So the dress doesn't necessarily need to even be the whole dress. It could just be a rectangle. And then you draw this shape on the side and this shape on the side, you know? Okay.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
Else's sketches. These are Jonathan's sketches. Did you have any idea about those, Jonathan, that you needed help with? Or do you feel like you know what you're doing?
Well, the one for the night, I had some trouble doing.
Have you started working on these in Illustrator, Jonathan?
Well, not yet. But I had some trouble coming up with like how it's gonna look like.
So
And,
one suggestion I have for you, Jonathan, is that you're more than welcome to look at reference. So you shouldn't copy other artwork, but you look at reference for knights, so you can get an idea of the way that they are. Like what is it that makes a piece of armor? How does the armor work? That kind of thing. Knights would have. Do you know what chainmail is?
yeah.
Chainmail is that metal knitting, in a sense, that they would wear, that connects the armor to the other piece of the armor. So, for instance, where there's a gap in the armor at the shoulders or at the neck, they would have chainmail. And then all the other pieces would be separate pieces. So, like on your drawings, on the bodies, for instance, it feels like one piece, but the armor is really made out of pieces. There's one on the back, one on the front that are sort of strapped on. So maybe you should look at that a little bit more in terms of getting the details right. I also don't think as cartoon characters, they have to be totally realistic. You can simplify that down and you can abstract it a little bit, but it should have some relationship to the way that armor actually works, I think. So if you were to do a Google search, one of the things about armor is that it's sort of articulated, right? So you oftentimes have these layers that overlap, like this on the hips, kind of like an armadillo. An armadillo, in a sense, is where they base, or those kinds of creatures anyway, with shells, is where they get the ideas for a lot of this. So this articulated stuff on the shoulders and the hips allows it to move a little bit. Probably not as much as you'd want, but it allows it to move a little bit. So look at some of those examples for inspiration as to how to draw it. Does that help?
All right. Yeah, it does.
Okay. Is there anybody else that has sketches that they're not sure how they would go about producing them? These are Denise's. These are your sketches, are they, Denise?
Yeah, I did like a series of them.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Yeah, they're really cute.
Good job.
Thank you.
Well, one thing I should point out, Denise, is that they do all have to be full bodies. So you can't have just the head and shoulders, okay?
Okay, full bodies.
But I really like the style you're going with.
I was leaning.
Yeah, you go ahead. Say what you're going to.
Yeah, I was leaning more towards the first row just because I like just all one color.
I was going to say, actually, the ones that I like the best are the ones that don't have the black outline. They have the colored outlines. The ones on the top row.
Okay.
I feel like it makes them a little bit more unique.
Yeah. Okay. Then I'll definitely go with those. I was leaning more towards those, but now that you said that, also.
Yeah, I think that those ones are looking really interesting. I just want to see them as the complete bodies. Okay.
Thank you.
Let's have a look at somebody else's. So this is Christopher's work. I like the under construction one, Christopher. That's funny. So one thing I'd say about them, Chris, is that you have a good sense of continuity between the style of the three different heads. You do need to work on the bodies now.
Yes.
Okay, but that's okay. Part of the continuity is the black, white, and red, obviously. So whether you're going to stay with that, I don't know, but it does create a sense of continuity between them. And then also the fact that they're all drawn out of kind of basic shapes. They have a very kind of geometric quality about them. All right, very good. Does anybody else have suggestions for Chris? Let's have a look at Amanda's. So are there any of these, Amanda, that you're not quite sure how you'd go about drawing them, like when you get into Illustrator? Or do you feel pretty comfortable that you know how to approach them? Are you there, Amanda? Amanda's gone silent. All right, well, I'm going to have to leave anyway because I have to get ready for this 11 o'clock meeting. So I'm just going to wrap things up. But just to remind you, for next week, what is due is that you should have the character designs completed so that you can present for critique next week. And then you should also have that exercise sheet 4 completed, okay? And then if you have any questions during the week, you're always welcome to set up an individual meeting with me. If you need to go over stuff or you need help with anything, I'm quite happy to meet with you to go over stuff. I'm not going to do a lab today just because I have this meeting that's going to go on and I don't know how long it's going to go on for. But if you do want to meet, just let me know. I'll probably be available later this afternoon.